Hey, it's Good Friday 2026. And so I'm thinking a lot about the cross and why Jesus died on a cross. And it occurs to me that how you understand the cross has everything to do with whether or not Christianity is actually a beautiful, life-giving, truthful, justice-loving, world-changing, healing religion, or whether or not it is a huge part of the problem in the world, as it is with the Christian nationalism of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Hey, it's Brian Sergio of Big Love Spirituality Podcast, episode 6. And yeah, I want to talk about the cross a little bit since it's Good Friday. Actually, Holy Week in general. The last week of Jesus' life that begins with him entering the city on that donkey on what we call Palm Sunday. I like to refer to Palm Sunday as Provocation Sunday because I think Jesus was deliberately provoking a final showdown with the powers that be, the religious authorities of his own religion, the Jewish religion, and the state authorities of the Roman Empire. I think Jesus was deliberately provoking a showdown. But one of the most important things, as far as I'm concerned, was that he did so with great humility. That's why he entered on a donkey in the fulfillment of the prophecy from Zechariah, entered humbly on a donkey and not a war horse. And while he was confrontational, one of the first things he did was turn over the tables in the temple, and I won't take time to get into that, but that was a very confrontational act, which he knew would get him into some serious trouble and possibly even get him targeted for arrest and maybe even execution. But he did it anyway because he felt this confrontation had to happen, that there was a time for nonviolent, direct, acting love that stands for justice and for compassion and truth and integrity to call out the powers of the empire and the corruption of his own religious and political leadership. And he knew full well, Jesus knew for his entire 3-year public ministry that it would end this way. He kept on trying to tell his disciples. And Luke 9:22 is one of the verses. It says that we're going to go to Jerusalem and I am going to be rejected and I'm going to suffer and be killed. And then on the third day, I will rise again. He knew that this experience of being violently attacked, confronted, and put to death was likely, if not inevitable. And he also knew that that would not be the end of the story, that in fact it was a crucial part of the story. And, when I think about it, I'm always just blown away by the courage and the focus and the clarity that Jesus had. And I can't imagine how stressful and difficult that would have been to carry, knowing the whole time. And yet he was still so kind and gentle and inclusive and loving to everyone, including those with whom he disagreed, although he did not suffer hypocrisy and corruption, especially among the religious leadership. So anyway, sometime I'll make another podcast about some of the other events of Holy Week. When I was a pastor, I actually created an extra holiday during Holy Week called Alabaster Wednesday, where we focus on Mary Magdalene and the anointing of Jesus and the relationship between Jesus and Mary and the love between them, which I think had a whole lot to do with Jesus finding the strength to face what he faced, and also entrusting Mary, who was the first person to come to the tomb and see the risen Christ on Easter morning, and trusting her with the continuation of the message that the two of them embodied together. But that's another podcast also. But back to Jesus and the crucifixion. You ever wonder why, if Jesus came to overcome the powers of sin and death and destruction and evil, if he came to overcome that, why he did so through something as wild, really, and unexpected and scandalous, both theologically and intellectually, as dying as a victim on a cross, slaughtered. I mean, in what sense did that and does that overcome the powers of evil? Well, in a nutshell, what he was saying was trust love. Take love to the extreme, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's not costly or dangerous. Confront evil and injustice with nothing but love and truth. And he didn't have a death wish. He wasn't trying to get himself killed, but he was not naive. He knew that standing up to the powers of evil would cause him to encounter this struggle, this confrontation that may well and likely would get him killed. And yet he knew that was the way. That was the intention. Again, not to get killed, but to take love to the limit, even if you get killed. And trust that the power of the divine on the other side of that confrontation would be and have the final word and the consummation in history. And that's a big part of what the gospel is all about. And if you're going to follow Jesus, I mean, he himself said, look, count the cost here. The cross is not a piece of jewelry. It was the instrument of execution used by the state at that time. He knew full well that the powers that are invested in selfishness, in profiteering off dominating power, that those powers would not tolerate being challenged, especially by some naive dreamer who thinks he's the Messiah. And so they tried to shut him up by killing him. And he knew all along that you can't stop the truth and you can't stop the power of love with power of violence. You can't. And he knew that evil would eventually destroy itself. Now, I don't have time in this podcast to get into, well, if that's what Jesus stood for, and 2,000 years later, why are we still dealing with evil? In what sense? He showed us the way. He gave us the methodology, and now is entrusting it to us. Will we take on the powers with love, with truth? Will we confront them clearly, provoke confrontation, but with love and nonviolence? G.K. Chesterton once said, it's not that Christianity has been tried and found. It's just that it's never really been tried. I often find myself thinking about that. I mean, yes, there have been brave individuals, St. Francis, other heroes and heroines throughout history, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., Oscar Romero, countless individuals and communities, Dorothy Day. But we as a body of Christ, which was supposed to be the community that would be big enough, wide enough, broad enough, strong enough, great enough as a community to rise up in the spirit of nonviolent love, we haven't done it yet. And what's happening now, I think actually is, and this is another podcast also, but I think we're actually in the midst of the second coming of the Christ, of Christ consciousness. And it's not just those who follow Jesus. It is those from other spiritual camps, every religion, every spirituality, those who don't embrace a specific spirituality, those who see themselves as atheists, but people who are committed to truth and to love are rising up and finding each other, and there is an elevation of consciousness now that is confronting the powers of death with love. It is happening right now. We watched it happen in Minneapolis, and yes, there were tragic, heartbreaking losses but those who stood fast in nonviolent, confrontational love and dignity and refused to comply, refused to be bullied, drove out ICE and the powers from their city. We just saw an example of what nonviolent love does. And when I say love, I'm not talking about a warm, fuzzy feeling. Obviously, it's not that. But it is a refusal to fight violence with violence, knowing that that doesn't work. It just gets everybody and everything killed. And I don't know how many times over humankind needs to learn the futility of that strategy before we will begin to understand, hey, you know what? The only thing that has enough power to actually overcome the problems of the world is the love that causes us to encounter others with respect and a desire to understand and to share rather than dominate and plunder and take. The love which enables us to respect those who differ from us and try to understand how we can coexist and collaborate and be on this beautiful earth that God loved so much together. That is what Christ consciousness is doing now in and through those of us who are confronting power with love. And I am well aware that we're also in a showdown, actually within and among Christians, Christianity itself, ourselves. There is this phenomenon referred to as Christian nationalism. I often call it white Christian nationalism because there is a racist component to it as well. But I agree with politician James Tallarico, who is a Christian that I respect and love and admire and agree with his approach to understanding the teachings of Jesus and how to bring them to the public sphere. He says that Christian nationalism is the love of power, whereas the Christianity of the Jesus of the cross is the power of love. They are two not just different things, but unfortunately diametrically opposed things. And we right now have people like Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who likes to call himself the Secretary of War. But he is a Christian nationalist who just recently prayed that this holy war that he thinks that our war with Iran is, that this holy war would be successful and that God would bring about great violence. Here, I'll read you a piece of the prayer. It says, "Let every round of our ammunition find its mark against the enemies of righteousness and our great nation. Give our troops overwhelming violence of action against those who deserve no mercy." That is not the way of Jesus. That is idolatrous. That is worshiping a God of power and death and not a God of love and truth. And it's time for the rest of us to say, especially on days like Good Friday, that's not the gospel of Jesus. Jesus faced down the powers, those who confronted him, with nothing but love. That's the one that I'm following. And, I also recently heard Benjamin Netanyahu give a little speech in which he quoted a historian named Will Durant, who said that history shows us, unfortunately, that those who are evil enough and ruthless enough and cruel enough will overcome good with evil and enough violence. Here's his quote from his speech. He said, "History proves that, unfortunately, Jesus Christ has no advantage over Genghis Khan, because if you're strong enough, ruthless enough, powerful enough, evil will overcome good. And to that, I say, no way. No way." Now, we may not see an obvious overcoming of goodness over evil historically, and I understand why Netanyahu would think, given what he just did to the Palestinians in Gaza and is doing in West Bank and what Israel is doing in Lebanon now, the ruthless expansion and killing. I can see his philosophy, his theology being lived out in the ruthlessness and cruelty, and he believes that those who survive will be deemed the good. And it's just not true. And unfortunately, it is only going to lead to greater devastation and destruction for everyone, including the people of Israel. And I don't wish that on anyone. The gospel of Christ is a strategy, teaching, methodology through which everyone and all of creation gets loved and honored and cherished. It's not naive. It is naive, I would say, to think that you can dominate the world into submission. You know, one of my favorite teachers is a guy named Richard Rudd. He wrote a book called The Gene Keys, which has been blowing me away recently. I love it. I'll have more to say about that in some other episodes. But he just recently had a little video where he talked about this message of a love being so big, so vast. And this is the Big Love Spirituality podcast. So this big, vast love that it holds everything and encompasses everything. It's a goodness so big that it can even deal with evil. It's a kind of love that says, yeah, go off and make your mistakes. And in the end, you'll come back because you'll see that your selfishness and your evil and your power games, as impressed as you may be with them and as rich as you may make yourselves through the defense industry, etc., by creating wars that you will profit off of. And by the way, we should be following the money right now when it comes to this. That's another episode also, but it's going to come out that the oil industry and the weapons industry and those who were inside trading along with that, it's all going to come out. But there's this love that says, you guys, you can play all those games as tragic and costly to the world and to real precious children of God as they are. You can play them as much as you want. But in the end, only love is going to stand the test of time. Only love will matter, and everyone and everything is going to be healed in the end. So, Richard Rudd, he has this little clip where he talks about the fighting scene that culminates in one of the Star Wars movies, and where Obi-Wan Kenobi is fighting Darth Vader. Remember at the end, and they're getting into this fight, and I wrote it down. It says Darth Vader says, well, I'm the master now, and Obi-Wan Kenobi says, you're only the master of evil, Darth. You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And he knows that evil will always ultimately destroy itself. And knowing that, Obi-Wan sees Luke Skywalker, the next generation, coming on, and he smiles and he holds the saber and lets Darth take him out, knowing full well that Darth can't beat him with a weapon. That is why I love the story of Jesus so much. He knew that no weapon, no force of evil and hatred and selfishness, and no narcissistic, malignant power can ever overcome the power of a love which is willing to lay down its own life for the sake of the well-being of everyone, including those who would oppose it. Greater love has no one than this, Jesus said. Well, that could be misunderstood and has been the meaning of the cross. I'm going to say more about that another time. But it is certainly Jesus's way of saying, you guys, don't try to fight the fire of hatred and violence and selfishness with the same. Only love will overcome in the end. And that's why I am committed more than ever, and I hope you're inspired to double down on your commitment to the way of big love, Christ love, the love that runs through every major religion and vision that there is, the love that will always bring us to the table of reconciliation and peace, where we will feed each other and make sure that everyone has what they need, not just to survive in this world, but to thrive. That's what the coming of the Christ that's permeating all religions right now. Use whatever language you want to use. Big love. It's happening, folks. Let's be on the side of love, which is the side of everyone and everything. I hope this day is meaningful to you. Let's not be naive about the price paid for standing for love. But let's not forget that you can't kill love. Truth knocked down will always rise again, greater than ever, with more power to transform and heal than ever. That's the good news.